The moment we arrived at Pinewood Camp on July 13, 2024, I felt a chill run down my spine. The dense forest seemed to swallow the light, casting long, eerie shadows over the rustic cabins. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a mixture both comforting and unsettling. We quickly unloaded our gear and settled into our cabin, a creaky old structure that seemed to have a life of its own. While unpacking, Jake found an old, dusty journal wedged between the floorboards. Curious, we gathered around as he opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with scrawled notes about a silent watcher who roamed the woods at night. The handwriting was frantic, as if the author was in a state of panic. We laughed it off as a spooky campfire story, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left me with. That night, we decided to explore the nearby trails. The forest was even more intimidating in the dark, with the only light coming from our flickering flashlights. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling as though we were being followed. The others joked and laughed, but I could sense they were just as scared as I was. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds around us grew louder. At one point, we heard what sounded like footsteps and faint laughter echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, straining to listen. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving us in an oppressive silence. My pulse quickened, and I suggested we head back to the cabin. Returning to the cabin, we were greeted by the sight of the journal lying open on the floor. We had left it closed and on the table. My stomach twisted with fear. Someone or something had been in our cabin while we were gone. We looked at each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who was the silent watcher? The next morning, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. But the unease lingered as we prepared for another day at Pinewood Camp. The journal was still on the floor, its pages open to a particularly disturbing entry about the watcher coming closer every night. We decided to put it back where we found it, hoping to forget about it and enjoy our time in the woods. That evening, we planned another hike, this time to a spot known as the Whispering Pines. As the sun set, the forest around us grew darker, the trees casting long, twisting shadows. The name of the trail seemed fitting, as every gust of wind through the pines sounded like hushed voices whispering secrets. I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest with every step we took deeper into the forest. As we walked, the sound of footsteps returned, this time closer and more distinct. It wasn't just my imagination. The others heard it too. We stopped, scanning the darkened woods with our flashlights. The beams of light revealed nothing but trees and underbrush. My heart pounded in my ears, and I fought the urge to run. We decided to turn back, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each passing minute. On our way back, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown path that none of us had noticed before. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to follow it. The path led to a small clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The sight of it sent shivers down my spine. It looked abandoned, yet there was something about it that felt very much alive. We cautiously approached the cabin, our flashlights illuminating its weathered exterior. Just as we were about to step onto the porch, a figure darted out from the shadows and disappeared into the woods. We froze, too stunned to move. The figure had been watching us, lurking in the darkness. My blood ran cold, and I knew we needed to leave immediately. Back at our own cabin, we were too scared to sleep. Every creak, every rustle outside sent us into a state of high alert. The journal was still where we had left it, but it now seemed to hold an ominous presence. We gathered in the center of the room, our backs to each other, keeping a vigilant watch. The night stretched on endlessly, the silence only broken by our racing hearts. The next morning, the weight of exhaustion hung heavily over us. The events of the night had left us all on edge, and the mysterious figure from the cabin haunted our thoughts. Despite our fear, we tried to carry on with our plans. We spent the day hiking and fishing, but the feeling of being watched never left us. As evening approached, we decided to stay closer to our cabin, hoping to avoid any more encounters with the silent watcher. We built a fire and sat around it, trying to create a sense of normalcy. The crackling flames and the smell of burning wood provided some comfort, but the shadows beyond the firelight seemed to move with a life of their own. As the night deepened, strange noises began to emanate from the forest. It started with the sound of leaves rustling, then footsteps, and finally, a low, eerie humming. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us silently acknowledging that we were not alone. Our flashlights flickered on, and we scanned the perimeter, seeing nothing but darkness. Then, without warning, the door to our cabin creaked open. We jumped to our feet, hearts pounding in our chests. Slowly, cautiously, we approached the door. It was dark inside, our flashlights cutting through the blackness, revealing nothing unusual. But the journal was missing from its spot on the floor. Panic set in. Who had taken it, and why? We barricaded ourselves inside, every creak and groan of the old cabin amplifying our fear. The humming outside grew louder, more insistent, as if beckoning us to come out. I could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with dread. We huddled together, trying to find solace in each other's presence, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the door, followed by silence. We held our breath, waiting, listening. The humming stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest. We exhaled in unison, the tension momentarily easing. But the question lingered. Who was the silent watcher, and what did they want with us? The following day, we were determined to uncover the mystery of the silent watcher. Our fear was now mingled with a need for answers. We spent the morning searching the woods around the cabin, hoping to find any clue that might explain the eerie events. The forest was dense, every shadow seeming to hide something sinister. We decided to return to the dilapidated cabin we had discovered. The path seemed even more overgrown, as if it was trying to keep us away. As we approached the clearing, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence fell over us. The cabin stood there, looking as abandoned and haunting as before. We hesitated, but our curiosity pushed us forward. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. Cobwebs draped the corners, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. In the center of the room, we found the journal, open to a page we hadn't seen before. The entry spoke of a ritual meant to protect the camp from an ancient presence. It warned that anyone who disrupted the ritual would be watched and haunted until they restored the balance. As we read, we heard footsteps outside the cabin. We froze, barely daring to breathe. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was an old man, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. He introduced himself as the last caretaker of Pinewood Camp, explaining that he had been trying to keep the ritual alive. When we found the journal and disturbed its resting place, we had unknowingly broken the protection. The old man told us the story of the Silent Watcher, a spirit bound to the camp, watching over it and punishing those who disrespected the land. He offered to help us restore the balance and end the haunting. We had to perform the ritual described in the journal, using items hidden around the camp. We gathered the necessary items: a piece of wood from the oldest tree, water from the clearest stream, and a stone from the highest hill. The old man guided us through the steps of the ritual, his voice steady despite the growing tension. As we completed the final step, a heavy silence fell over the forest, followed by a feeling of release and peace. With the ritual complete, the oppressive atmosphere around us began to lift. The old man smiled, a look of relief washing over his weathered face. He explained that the spirit of the Silent Watcher would now return to its peaceful state, no longer bound to haunt those who ventured into Pinewood Camp. We thanked him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and respect for the land we had come to know. As dawn broke, the forest seemed to come alive with a newfound energy. Birds chirped merrily, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm golden glow. We packed our belongings, preparing to leave Pinewood Camp with a mix of relief and sadness. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also brought us closer together and given us a deeper appreciation for the history of the place. Before we left, we returned to the clearing one last time. The dilapidated cabin stood there, now just an old building with a story to tell. We placed the journal back where we had found it, making sure to respect the old man's wishes. As we turned to leave, I felt a sense of closure and peace. The Silent Watcher had been laid to rest, and the camp would once again be a place of tranquility. Driving away from Pinewood Camp, we couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few days. The fear, the mystery, and the ultimate resolution had left a lasting impression on us. We knew we would never forget the Silent Watcher and the lessons we had learned about respect and balance. The experience had changed us in ways we were only beginning to understand. As we crossed the camp's boundary, I glanced back one last time. The forest stood tall and proud, its secrets now at rest. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the adventure we had shared and the bond we had formed. Pinewood Camp would always hold a special place in our hearts, a reminder of the Silent Watcher and the peace that comes from honoring the past. On August 19th, 2021, we arrived at Cedar Creek Camp, a serene place nestled by a crystal-clear lake surrounded by towering mountains. The tranquility of the camp was in stark contrast to the unsettling stories we had heard. As we set up our tents, a fellow camper mentioned a mysterious disappearance that had occurred years ago, casting a shadow over the camp's idyllic setting. The first night, we decided to explore the campgrounds. The lake was still, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. As we walked along the shore, the cool breeze carried whispers of the past. We felt a mixture of excitement and unease, the thrill of the unknown tugging at our curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, grounding us in the moment. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we came across a forgotten cabin. It looked abandoned, its windows broken, and the door hanging off its hinges. Intrigued, we cautiously approached, our flashlights illuminating the interior. Dusty furniture and old photographs gave the cabin a haunted feel. Suddenly, we heard footsteps outside, causing us to freeze in our tracks. We hurried out, our hearts pounding, and saw a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in stunned silence. The encounter left us shaken, but also more determined to uncover the mystery of Cedar Creek. We returned to our tents, the thrill of the night still buzzing in our veins. As we settled in for the night, the sounds of the forest enveloped us. The rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures were a stark reminder of where we were. Despite the unsettling encounter, exhaustion eventually took over, and we drifted into a restless sleep. Our minds filled with images of the shadowy figure and the stories of the past. The following morning, we awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The mysterious figure and the eerie atmosphere of Cedar Creek had piqued our curiosity. After a quick breakfast, we decided to explore more of the camp. The day was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the unsettling events of the previous night. The lake sparkled under the sunlight, and the mountains stood tall and imposing in the distance. We ventured along the trails, our eyes scanning the surroundings for any clues. As we walked, we came across an old, faded map pinned to a tree. The map detailed the layout of Cedar Creek Camp, with various landmarks marked, including the cabin we had found the night before. One mark caught our attention, a red X near the edge of the camp, labeled Old Chapel. Intrigued, we decided to head towards the chapel. The trail was overgrown, the trees forming a dense canopy above us. The air grew cooler, and the forest quieter as we approached. The chapel stood in a small clearing, its wooden structure weathered and covered in vines. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside, we found rows of dusty pews and a broken altar. Sunlight streamed through the cracked windows, casting eerie patterns on the floor. As we explored, we noticed strange symbols carved into the wood. They looked like they had been hastily scratched into the surface. The sense of unease grew stronger, and we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the chapel, extinguishing our flashlights. Panic set in as we fumbled to turn them back on. When the lights flickered back to life, we saw a figure standing at the entrance, shrouded in shadow. The figure stared at us for a moment before disappearing into the forest. We stood frozen, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do next. We decided to leave the chapel and head back to camp, our minds racing with questions. Who was the figure? What did the symbols mean? The mystery of Cedar Creek was deepening, and we were determined to find answers. As we walked back, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The next day, the unease from our encounter at the chapel lingered. Determined to uncover more, we decided to split up and search different areas of the camp for clues. The stories of the past and the strange events we had experienced so far had turned our trip into an obsessive quest for answers. We agreed to meet back at the main campfire area by sunset. I headed towards the lake, where the water lapped gently against the shore. The serenity of the scene was at odds with the tension I felt inside. As I walked along the edge, I noticed something glinting in the water. Bending down, I fished out an old, tarnished locket. The locket was engraved with initials and a date, LM 1947. Inside, there was a small, faded photograph of a young woman. I wondered if this could be connected to the disappearance we had heard about. Meanwhile, Jake ventured deeper into the woods near the northern boundary of the camp. He followed a narrow, winding path that led to an area we hadn't explored yet. The trees here were older and denser, their thick branches creating an almost oppressive canopy. As he pushed through the underbrush, he stumbled upon a small, hidden clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching out like twisted arms. At the base of the tree, Jake found another set of strange symbols carved into the bark. These symbols matched those we had seen in the chapel, and the discovery sent a shiver down his spine. Elsewhere, Emily explored the area around the old mess hall. The building was a decaying relic of the past, its roof partially caved in and windows shattered. She cautiously stepped inside, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. As she moved through the mess hall, she found an old, leather-bound journal hidden in a cabinet. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas, a former camp counselor. As she flipped through the pages, she read about strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances that had plagued the camp for years. One entry stood out: the symbols. They keep appearing. The chapel, the old oak, the lake. I fear what they mean. We reconvened at the campfire, sharing our findings. The locket, the symbols, and the journal painted a chilling picture. It seemed Cedar Creek had a dark history that was trying to resurface. The symbols appeared to be some sort of warning, or perhaps a part of a ritual. We were deep into our discussion when we noticed the sun dipping below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the camp. As darkness fell, we decided to return to the chapel, believing it to be the key to understanding the mystery. The walk there was tense, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the chapel looked even more foreboding in the moonlight. The carvings seemed to glow faintly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. We gathered around the altar, the journal in hand, trying to piece together what we had learned. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with an unsettling silence. The door creaked open, and we saw the same shadowy figure from before. This time, it stepped inside, its features becoming more distinct. It was a man, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. He raised a hand, pointing to the journal. His voice, a whisper that seemed to echo through the chapel, said, "You must complete the ritual to end this." We were frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. The journal described a ritual to banish the malevolent presence that had haunted the camp for decades. We had all the pieces: the locket, the symbols, the oak tree. We had to perform the ritual before it was too late. The figure faded, leaving us with a sense of urgency and fear. Determined, we gathered the items and prepared for the ritual. As we began, the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. The symbols started to glow brighter, and a low hum filled the air. We followed the instructions meticulously, hoping to end the curse and bring peace to Cedar Creek. We stood in the chapel, the journal open before us, its pages detailing the steps of the ritual. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. Each of us held a key item. I had the locket. Jake had a small vial of water from the lake, and Emily held a piece of bark from the ancient oak tree. The figure's whisper echoed in my mind as we began the ritual. The first step required us to place the items on the altar. The locket, the vial, and the bark were arranged in a triangle. each representing a part of Cedar Creek's history. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly as we positioned the objects. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature in the chapel dropped even further, our breath visible in the cold air. Emily read aloud from the journal, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped us all. With these items, we call upon the spirits of Cedar Creek. We seek to end the curse and bring peace to this land. As she spoke, the air around us seemed to vibrate, a low hum filling the chapel. The symbols glowed brighter, casting an eerie light across the room. The next step involved marking ourselves with the symbols. Using a piece of charcoal, we carefully drew the ancient symbols on our foreheads and hands. The moment the symbols touched my skin, a sharp pain shot through me, followed by a strange sense of clarity. It was as if the symbols were connecting us to the past, linking us to the spirits that haunted Cedar Creek. Jake was the first to notice the change outside. Through the chapel's broken windows, we saw shadows moving in the forest, circling the chapel. The low hum grew louder, almost a chant, as if the forest itself was coming alive. We exchanged nervous glances, but continued with the ritual. We had come too far to turn back now. Emily continued reading from the journal. The final step requires us to speak the names of those lost, to acknowledge their presence and set them free. She turned the page, revealing a list of names, each one a camper or counselor who had vanished over the years. We took turns reading the names aloud, our voices mingling with the hum of the forest. As we spoke the final name, a deafening silence fell over the chapel. The air grew still, and the glowing symbols began to pulsate with a rhythmic light. The shadows outside stopped moving, as if waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation almost unbearable. Then, without warning, a blinding light filled the chapel, forcing us to shield our eyes. When the light faded, the shadowy figure stood before us once more, but this time it was not alone. The outlines of other figures, faint but recognizable, surrounded it. The figure that had spoken to us earlier stepped forward, its face now clearer. It was Thomas, the counselor who had written the journal. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude and sorrow. "You have freed us." As he spoke, the other figures nodded, their forms growing fainter. The symbols on our skin grew warm, then faded completely, leaving only a sense of calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over Cedar Creek lifted, replaced by a feeling of peace. The figures began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting ours. "Remember the past, but do not let it define you," he said, his voice growing fainter. "The curse is lifted. Cedar Creek is free." With those final words, he vanished, leaving us in the now serene chapel. We stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The forest outside was calm, the shadows gone. The chapel, once a place of fear, now felt like a sanctuary. We had done it. The curse was lifted, and the spirits were at peace. We gathered our things, leaving the chapel with a sense of closure. As we walked back to camp, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over Cedar Creek. The nightmare was over, and the camp was finally at peace. We knew we would never forget this place or the spirits we had freed. Cedar Creek would always be a part of us, a reminder of the power of the past and the strength of unity. With the dawn breaking, we felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The heavy weight that had been pressing on us since our arrival at Cedar Creek was lifted. The forest, now bathed in the golden light of the morning sun, seemed welcoming and serene. We made our way back to the main camp, where we found the other campers waking up, blissfully unaware of the ordeal we had endured. Our thoughts turned to the journal, the locket, and the other items we had used for the ritual. We decided to place them in a secure spot, somewhere they could be preserved without disturbing the peace we had restored. Back at our cabin, we found an old, sturdy wooden box. It seemed fitting to use it to store the items that had played such a crucial role in lifting the curse. As we packed the items away, Emily suggested we leave a note for future visitors, explaining what had happened and how to keep the camp safe. We wrote a detailed account of our experiences, including the ritual and the importance of respecting the symbols and the land. Placing the journal and the note inside the box, we buried it near the ancient oak tree, marking the spot with a simple stone cairn. With our task complete, we spent the rest of the day exploring Cedar Creek one last time, appreciating the beauty and tranquility of the camp. The lake, now free of its sinister aura, sparkled invitingly. The forest, which had seemed so foreboding, was now a place of solace. As we walked, we noticed small changes: the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the gentle breeze. It was as if the camp itself was breathing a sigh of relief. That evening, we gathered around the campfire with the other campers. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the twilight sky. We shared stories, laughed, and enjoyed the company of newfound friends. The fear and tension of the past few days melted away, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and joy. As the night deepened, we gazed at the stars, feeling a profound connection to the history and spirit of Cedar Creek. Just as we were preparing to retire to our tents, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the campfire light. It was Thomas, his form faint but unmistakable. He approached us with a gentle smile, his presence serene and comforting. "I wanted to thank you again," he said softly. "You have given us peace and restored the balance to Cedar Creek." We were stunned, but grateful for the opportunity to see him once more. "What will happen now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked around the camp, his expression thoughtful. "The spirits are at rest, and the camp will remain a place of peace and reflection. But remember, the land must always be respected. The past is a part of us, but it should not define us. You have done well, and Cedar Creek will thrive because of it." With those words, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the night. We watched in silence, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. The encounter reaffirmed our belief that we had done the right thing, that we had honored the spirits and the history of Cedar Creek. As the fire died down, we made our way to our tents, the events of the past few days playing in our minds. The fear, the mystery, and the resolution had changed us, deepening our bond and our appreciation for the land and its stories. We knew we would carry this experience with us always, a reminder of the power of unity, respect, and the enduring spirit of Cedar Creek.